Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to Atlantic Bushcraft Adventures. Tonight we're on episode 218, and we want to take a little bit of time to talk about tick-borne illnesses. And this is one of those topics that it was actually one of our listeners had reached out to me and was telling me about a story. And normally around this time of year, Ben, we kind of, give people a gentle reminder, ticks are out there, ticks ain't that great. We talk a lot about Lyme disease and stuff like that, and a lot of people are aware of Lyme disease, but it gets glossed over fairly often that ticks can actually cause a lot of other diseases and bacterial infections and viruses and things like that are just really no good for you. And unfortunately, this is kind of what happened to our listener. So I have his story. He's going to be joining us in the comments here very shortly. His name's Scott. And we're going to talk about his story a little bit and, just kind of brush up on some of the tick stuff. But I know being on the other side of the country now, Ben, what are ticks like out there for you now?
I haven't seen any. That's not to say they're not here. I assume they are here. I just don't know how bad they are. It's not been a huge part of conversation around here. So that's, that piece remains to be seen.
And that's fair. And the reason I ask is because where you're originally from, Ben, over in Newfoundland, ticks were like never a thing there for the longest time. There was provinces in Canada where ticks were pretty much unheard of. PEI, it's a prime example. They basically don't have ticks.
Yeah. And Newfoundland was no until very, very recently. Relatively to me, like it's just. I've grown up, I don't remember hearing them. Now, I guess I've been away from Newfoundland for 20 years, so maybe they're much more prevalent for 15 of those years. But yeah, it wasn't at least province-wide, but now I do hear that they're being found over there much more frequently. I can do a quick search to see what the prevalence of them are here.
But I mean, it kind of goes without saying that ticks are pretty much everywhere now. I mean, there's still some untouched spots. We just discussed that. But because of, things getting warmer, our seasons stay warmer longer, climate change, we're not getting as much snow in the winters. The really cold winters we used to get, where you used to be like minus 40 for a couple weeks at a time, or minus 30 more realistically. We used to get minus 40, don't get me wrong, but it would be minus 30 for a couple of weeks. We really don't get that anymore here in Nova Scotia. And I mean, you seen the tail end of that when you were still here, Ben. Like, it's odd for winter to be minus 20 for more than a day or two now here. And that's kind of the way it's going in a lot of other places as well. You know what I mean?
Yeah. I actually just quickly found something I sent it to you. So, yes, there is ticks here. But it seems to be not like province-wide. That's a Lyme risk area, but
I mean, where there's Lyme or Lyme risk, there's obviously black-legged ticks. And once again, we mentioned right at the start of this episode that Lyme is the common one. It is the hot topic. It's in the media a fair bit. Most people, when they hear the word tick, this is what they're thinking of. Because Lyme, for a long time, believe it or not, there was debate if it was real. And I know that's kind of hard to hear, sad to say, but I had a family practitioner when I worked for Natural Resources that I had gone in and I had been like, hey, I've been bitten by a black-legged tick. We sent it in. It tested positive for Lyme. I'm just here for my due diligence. And literally my family doctor at the time said, well, it's debatable if it's even real. There's a lot of us, and I do quote, a lot of us, that think it's just all hocus pocus. You know what I mean? And it's become...
Is that the last day you went to that doctor?
Well, our severe lack of practicing doctors in this area, so unfortunately, no, it was not, but he had later retired, and now I'm left without a family practitioner. But it was honestly true. It wasn't just him. I had heard the same story from many people, and this was only as far back as, like, the early 2000s to the mid-2000 teens, that there's still a big belief that, oh yeah, ticks don't give you Lyme disease, that's all made up. And it wasn't only until recently, and I say like the last 10 years, 10, 15 years, that people were really like, no, 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 there's something to this. You know what I mean? And I mean, little conspiracy theory here, cap on. There's some belief that Lyme disease could have been man introduced. Came off an island somewhere down in the States is where they tracked it back to, where they were studying some forms of contagious diseases. But I mean, that could all be coincidence, blah, 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 blah. I highly encourage people to do their own research on that. I'm not saying it was or isn't. It's just, it's out there and people say this, and then that's where it leads to, oh, it's all hocus pocus, it's a conspiracy theory, and blah, blah, blah. But the reality is it is out there. Most of the governments have recognized it at this point. They do give you some information on it, being, like if you get a bullseye rash. This is the big one. Everybody says, oh, I can't have Lyme. I never had the bullseye rash. And this is kind of our lead into Scott's story. Scott didn't have Lyme. Scott had something here, and sorry for butchering this, Scott, but I think I got it right. It's anaplasmosis? Does that sound right? Anaplasmosis, I think. Yeah, you're getting the dyslexic to try and say big words, which is no fun. But anyway, so what anaplasmosis is it's a bacterial-borne... Okay, cool. Scott said that is right. So it's a bacterial-borne disease that gets into your blood, and it can really wreak some havoc. So I'm going to read this word for word as to what he sent me about a story. Scott is joining us in the comments here. So if there's any corrections or anything to add into it, I'm sure he'll include this. But so this is how the whole topic started. He said, hey, here's a topic for the podcast. I just spent the last 4 days in the hospital with anaplasmosis, a tick-borne illness. I'm going to stumble over that word a lot. So, my heart stopped once at home, causing me to fall and bash my head off an antique nightstand, giving me concussion and 4 stitches above my eye. Ended up in the emergency room with 103 fever, liver functions all whacked out, dizzy, disoriented, and a whole host of other symptoms. I kind of remember my systolic pressure, and if people aren't familiar, you have a systolic and a diastolic. So when you read your blood pressure, 120 over 80, the 120 is your systolic. That is how much pressure is in your body, like when your heart is contracted. Diastolic is when your heart's at rest. So anyway, systolic pressure hovering right around room temperature. So I mean, that's not good. You know what I mean? Ended up with 3 days of IV doxycycline, which is basically a strong antibiotic, and just under a dozen bags of normal fluid. So obviously there's some dehydration that went along with this. My tick bite was 9 days prior. No bullseye rash, no other symptoms, and then it hit him like a truck. My heart stopped the second time in the hospital. I was wearing a heart monitor for the next 2 weeks. You don't need a bullseye rash for them little monsters to mess you up good. And this is the thing. I had actually asked him, making sure he was all right, and we got chatting a little bit, and then I had said, Scott, was the tick engorged when you found it, and how long was it on? And we got talking about this, and let's see. I am just trying to find it here. I had to scroll down. I can't find it specifically here, but I'm sure he'll correct me. He said that it was less than 24 hours attached to his body. He thought it was dead when he pulled it off. It was not engorged in any way, shape, or form. He figured the biggest problem he might have had was, left some of the mouth parts in, which is common when removing ticks. If you don't get them out right with a pair of needle nose tweezers or a tick puller, there is some chance of leaving some of the mouth parts in there. But it's not necessarily the mouth parts that's going to cause this problem. That usually causes some sort of skin infection, something like that, which can lead to other problems. Don't get me wrong, that's still an issue. But the main point of this was, the tick was on him for a short amount of time. It was not engorged. And these are the two big things that most people reference anytime they get a tick on them. Would you not say, Ben?
Yeah, for sure. No, 100% that's what they reference. But we do know, and we've been hearing this for years, that there are other diseases. The Lone Star one's the one I bring up. My wife is apparently sick and tired of me speaking of that. But there are insects in general. I mean, I think for years they said mosquitoes kill more people than any other animal, or is responsible for more human deaths than any other animal, and it's because they carry disease. So ticks, no different. They can carry disease. And you get bit by one, there's definitely a risk, and it's why we need to avoid this at all reasonable cost. Um, that means you can't. I mean, if you want to stop going outside and all that, then yeah, I guess you can completely eliminate it, but that seems unreasonable. Um, you know, use the deterrence and the clothing methods that best protect you, which is basically cover skin, stuff like that. Um,
Well, we're on that topic, Ben. Let's talk about some of the preventive measures. You did say you can cover your skin. So longer sleeve shirts, longer legged pants, providing you don't get too hot. I know it looks goofy as sin, but if you take your pant legs and tuck them into your socks so that your socks come over your pants, that's one less method that they can enter in. If you're wearing a t-shirt like I'm wearing here, tuck that into your pants. This makes them so they have to travel up and they're less likely to get into like your leg areas and things like that. Scott mentioned that his was, somewhere between his waist and knees. So I mean, it most likely went up a pant leg or something like that, and this does happen, and you can't always see them because ticks have a bite that you don't necessarily feel. They put a numbing agent in, and they're a pool drinker, so they have to put their mouth parts in. They make a small cut. They put in an anticoagulant. The blood pools inside, and they suck it back up. Now, what was believed for a long time was when you got sick was when they went to detach themselves, they would regurgitate some of the fluid out, and that would get in your blood system. You know what I mean? And that's where potentially you could get sick. There is, if you look at the life cycle of Lyme disease, there's a little bit of truth to that. Just Lyme, not the other diseases, but Lyme will rest dormant in a tick's stomach. Once it gets a thing of blood into it, it becomes active, it's going to make its way back out, and then it's going to get in your bloodstream. So, technically it could take a little bit of time. But I digress. So anyway, we are covering our legs and stuff, and now we can look at some of the chemical deterrents. And you might actually be a little better at this than I would be, Ben, because you had some clothing that had this stuff embedded into it.
I still do. Yeah, so the no-fly zone has a pyrethium or perithium.
Pethrin or something like that. I know what you're talking about, yeah.
It's a liquid that once it dries, it's no longer harmful to humans, but the residue it leaves is harmful to the insects, and it will deter them. But even if they do it, I think it can cause harm to them, and it lasts through multiple washings and stuff, and it's a good product. And I've been hearing about it for years. You can buy this product, especially in the States, less so here in Canada, though. I'm told if you head over to your local farmers co-op type thing and ask about it, they sell it for horses. So I think you can put it on like a horse's blankets and stuff. You soak this material in, you leave it up to dry, and then it's safe to put around your animals and stuff. But in its liquid form, it's harmful to humans and pets, so be careful with it. Yeah, and it's definitely an option. DEET has been known to deter them or cause them harm, so you can put most types of fly repellent on. With ticks, ticks don't jump to you. Anyone who says, "Oh, a tick jumped up on me," ticks have surprisingly little ability to leave the ground, and what they do is they hang off branches and grass and wait for something to walk by, and they'll hook into it, not dissimilar to that of a burr. And like you said, they tend to crawl up. They just keep crawling up till they find a place that's comfortable, and then they latch on. So they will actually be physically onto you potentially for quite a while before they'll latch on. And they're looking for a warm, safe place that feels comfortable to them. So there's a reason you find them in the back of your knees, in your groin area. I mean, and the sad part of that, or the disappointing thing, is you're less likely to catch it there. So it's not an area that you're going to have somebody check easily, right?
Scott just clarified the chemical name is permethrin. Thank you very much, Scott. And yeah, sorry, go ahead.
So when you have to do a tick check, you have to do a full tick check. Like, pride and modesty might have to be pushed out the window a little bit. if you're seriously concerned that you have ticks on you, you check everything you can, but you may have to ask for help or enlist at least a good mirror and some time.
And yeah, so the chemical name was permethrin, and I am coming back to what you said there. I'm just trying to keep up with the comments that are going here. And yeah, it is toxic to cats, and it's toxic to fish. It actually goes in water, and it'll block their gills from being able to filter air out, and that's why you can't use it around rivers and lakes and stuff like that, because you can literally kill an entire fish population with a bottle of this stuff if you're not careful. It's also not really good to put directly on yourself. You should spray it on your clothes and let it dry. So back to Scott's story here. He's got a whole other gambit of blood work tomorrow, MRI to check for swelling of the brain, potentially a spinal tap. Because the blood work he got yesterday is so out of whack, it seems like it's attacking his organs. And this is the thing. These bacterial infections, like, they hit you like a truck, like he said. They will just slam you. They are recoverable from, but they do have a very long recovery time to them. So Ben here talked about some of the things that you can do to kind of prevent ticks, cover up, use some chemicals. Clothing you're going to wear, the lighter it is, the better for two things. One, lighter clothing typically is cooler. It's not absorbing as much as the UV rays and creating heat. And two, it makes it actually easier to see the ticks. And like you said with tick checks, tick check, I think we've talked about this in the past episodes when we mentioned ticks. Tick check, if you are an outdoors person, tick check should be a household term. If I go out into the woods, I come home and I say, hey Mel, I need a tick check. And like you said, very much so, modesty goes out the window. And I mean, honestly, to be blunt about it, you strip down naked and you get searched head to toe. Every inch of your body has to be checked, because there's areas where you as an individual have a difficult time seeing. And you can do it with a mirror. Full-size mirror and good lighting is a great way to do it, but it's always better to have somebody else, because they can check really the places you can't see really well. Somebody like myself that's freckled as well. Sometimes freckles can get mistaken for ticks when you're looking in a mirror. I have one dark freckle that's kind of halfway behind my back but under my arm, and every time I see it I'm like, crap, I got a tick. Then I'm like, no, that's the stupid freckle. But I mean, it can be a little misleading. I mean, it sounds funny, but it's really true. It can be misleading. Little skin blemishes, especially if you have a little fear of these things, you'll start seeing them everywhere. But yeah, tick check, modesty goes out the window, and just get a good look through. I mean, you got to look inside your ears and behind your ears, through your hair, across the back of your neck. As Ben mentioned, they tend to go to darker, more humid areas. That's why you get them in around your waistband, the back of your knees, like you said, your groin area. I know people are going to laugh, but you can get them literally in your bum crack. I mean, they go to places where they think they're not going to be rubbed off easily. You have to remember, ticks, their natural prey, for what lack of a better term, is usually mammals, you know what I mean? So deer, raccoons, rabbits, things like that. Wildland creatures that are running through bushes and things, and they'll get themselves up against trees and scratch themselves and try to pull ticks off and blah, 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 blah. So ticks try to go to places naturally where this isn't going to happen.
So my dog, for instance, I usually find them on or in their ears, sometimes in around their sort of like armpit area, and along their neck, especially near the collar. I've rarely found them on tails. I mean, I check her tail. I rarely find her on the lower legs, but you do find them along the stomach line, and especially in around the head and neck. I have heard numerous stories of people finding them on their genitalia, both male and female. It happens, and so just be aware of that. That's a good place to check. It's warm. It doesn't take a lot of abuse through the normal day-to-day run. Like you said, it's not going to get knocked off or damaged by being there. So it feels like a safe place to a tick, and it'll latch on. Plus, it's an area of good blood flow, so they'll sense the vessels pretty close.
And most of these areas that tend to be more humid, for instance, the skin tends to be thinner. Anywhere where you perspire or, gets humid, the skin tends to be thinner. On your arms and stuff, that's generally pretty tough skin. Legs, like your shins and stuff, not that they can't be there. I have seen pointing on my shins, don't get me wrong, but generally that is tougher skin, and they don't like that. They want to find a nice, dark, soft, humid area they can go, do their thing, and then fall off. And that's the thing. Ticks just gorge themselves. They blow up like grapes, and then they just kind of fall off. They're actually a pretty gross little creature, but they're kind of interesting, too.
Yeah.
If you can get past the blood-sucking parasite kind of deal with them. But there's a lot of common myths about ticks, and that's kind of where I wanted to go with some of these tick-borne illnesses, I guess. Because it's not the tick-borne illness so much as the misinformation about them, I guess. And just to mention some of the things, like I've included a couple links on this, the description of this podcast from the CDC that covers a lot of the tick-borne illnesses you can get, and some symptoms and stuff like that if people want to educate themselves. But another big one that is being missed, that you had mentioned, is the Lone Star tick, which is slowly moving into eastern Canada. I think it's now in New Brunswick. It's called alpha-gal or alpha-gall, however you want to say it. Anyway, alpha-gal syndrome. And this thing will bite you, and if you get infected with it, you can no longer eat any kind of red meat. So beef, out of the question. Which honestly sounds pretty terrible for somebody like me. I like a good steak and a hamburger. You know what I mean?
That's it. It's right there, Nick.
But I mean, there's lots of other things you can get too. There's Lyme disease, of course, which we've talked about. There's the Rocky Mountain spotted fever. There's tick-borne relapse fever. There's some interesting ones like rickettsiosis. I mean, there is a lot of other things you can get. Lyme is not the prime candidate. It is just the one that catches a lot of news and media because it's relatively new.
Yes. And like things like Lyme disease, you mentioned like for a while that the medical system almost pretty well ignored it. And it's interesting because they've had treatments out for dogs forever. I mean, years ago, I was able to get tick and flea medicine for my dog, and there was, if they'll test for Lyme disease right away and they'll treat it quite quickly. But we both knew a guy through the bushcrafting world. I mean, he's since passed away. I don't think it hurts to mention his name, but Graham Randall, he talked about it on his channel a few times. Like he openly talked about it, and he struggled to get diagnosed, and I think he ended up using for a lot of his life
naturopathic remedies.
Yeah, because he talked about it on Facebook and he talked about the struggle he went through dealing with it. So it's kind of really good that it's out there a bit more now and that people are talking about it, because it is really difficult when you have a disease and you're pretty sure you know what it is and you can't get the medical system behind you.
And that's the thing. There was a ton of misdiagnosis for a long time there. People would label it as depression or anxiety disorders or chronic fatigue syndrome. There's a lot of other things that they would umbrella this under, and that was not the case. You know what I mean? And the treatments for those are radically different than how you treat a bacterial infection. You know what I mean? So people were getting sicker and not better from a lot of this stuff just because of the lack of knowledge on it. So yeah, some of the myths, and I imagine you know some and I know some, so let's just, let's rifle some of these off. The big one that annoys me is ticks have to be on you for a minimum of 24 hours before you can potentially contract any kind of a virus or disease. I know that used to be the golden standard for a long time, and coming from a feller that worked for natural resources and I was told this stuff, I can tell you from experience that's not necessarily true. As soon as a tick bites onto you, complications can start, because it comes down to that when the tick regurgitates something into you, and even some of these things are in the saliva ducts, or whatever the equivalent of a tick has. I call them saliva ducts, and I think that's the correct term. I'm a little out of practice with this stuff, but anyway, even when they put that numbing solution on you and they put their mouth parts through your skin to start pulling blood, that can potentially get you infected with some of these other diseases and bacterial infections that are listed on the CDC website. Scott, so my blood panel may have been done too early because preliminary screening results are negative, even though clinically that's the way I presented. And this is the other problem. Even when you run some of the tests, especially for Lyme, there is a massive amount of false negatives. There's really only one decent place in North America. It's called IGeneX, I think, that tests for ticks. And it has a pretty good test, and I think it's still only like 70% accurate.
Crazy. Yeah. No, I mean, and that is a struggle, right? Like, even if it's negatives, you're still simple. Yeah. So, yeah, I mean, we had that with COVID. I mean, not to bring COVID into it, but false negatives were a real reality, and you could be affected for a period of time before it was evident that you really did have it. So I don't know that they can really predict any of this stuff, really. Like, it could be days, weeks. It may never really show up because maybe your load wasn't quite big enough, or maybe it's uniquely enough that what you have wasn't what they're searching for. You mentioned there's dozens of potential diseases that you can get from ticks, and they're only going to check for the top few, or the ones that are most likely to be in your area. Doesn't mean you couldn't have picked one up that has otherwise. So yeah, a tick honestly could bite you within minutes or within hours of it getting on you, and the second it bites you, there is a risk. That risk probably gets greater the longer it's bit, but just know that if you're bit, you have a risk, and you need to keep an eye on symptoms and see a doctor. And it's best if you can keep the tick, which I'm bad for. I usually just burn them or get rid of them. But if they can test the tick, it may be better than testing you.
Yeah, and that's exactly it. That's the other big thing that I was going to lead into, and perfect lead into it, is once you get the tick off you, don't just get rid of it. I mean, much like you, I'm pretty bad for it here too. I might be a little better than the average person to identify types of ticks, because that was one of the things I studied while I worked for Natural Resources. But I mean, I'm not an expert, and I don't pretend to be. And I should be keeping them. You can get little vials from the dollar store, and they're perfect. Put some rubbing alcohol in it, drop the tick in it. One, it's going to kill it, and two, it preserves it if you have to get it tested and you get sick. The thing is, after you have been bitten by a tick, it's best to keep that sucker for 30 days, which seems like a long time. But like Scott said, you may not be symptomatic right away. It's going to take a little bit of time for that bacteria to get into your system, start working its evil magic, and making you sick. And then this is where a lot of people sometimes have problems. It could be a couple weeks later, they start displaying symptoms, and they're like, well, that tick was ages ago. Can't possibly be something related to the tick. And it is.
So the alcohol kill any disease it may have had and make it harder to test?
Not necessarily. I mean, there is a risk of that, especially if you have broken the tick open or something like that. You try to tear it apart with your fingernails. Most times, that's what we recommended from Natural Resources, was to put it in a little vial with 50% rubbing alcohol, 50 to 70%. The lower, the better on this one, so 50% is what we recommended. Don't use hydrogen peroxide. Some people have done that. Hydrogen peroxide breaks down proteins, and eventually it will just dissolve the tick. The rubbing alcohol will preserve it to a degree, usually for the 30 days. For long periods of time, it would probably ruin the tick eventually as well. And most of us don't have access to like formaldehyde and stuff like that. So rubbing alcohol 50% for around 30 days, you should be okay. If it is definitely a black-legged tick, I'm with you. I generally don't put the alcohol in. I'll throw it in the vial and just leave it go. That way I know there's no any kind of interference and stuff like that. And once again, for the average person, it can be a little tricky to identify a black-legged tick from a brown-legged tick to a Lone Star tick to a snowshoe hare tick. Like, just in Nova Scotia, we have somewhere between 11 and 27 types of ticks. It's under debate. And there is a good number of ticks out there, is the bottom line, and they all have the potential to give you something that could be nasty. Honestly, I'd rather have a week of COVID again than this crap. And I 100% agree. I don't know what it was. I think it was a tick bite, much like Scott here last year. I think you remember there, Ben. I got a rash on my leg. I got really sick for a while. My leg basically stopped working. I was violently sick for a while, massive fevers. I went in, they acknowledged that I had some sort of infection, but they didn't know what, and they just started hammering me with antibiotics, and eventually, and we're talking like 2 months later, the rash started going away, and I started feeling a little bit better. But they tested me for Lyme, it came back negative. I don't think it was Lyme, but I think it was some other sort of tick-related bacterial infection, and once again, I mean, it just wasn't there to test for everything. And of course, I didn't keep the tick. It was on the back of my leg, much like Scott. It only been on for maybe 3-4 hours. Didn't really look like it had drawn any blood, and I just pulled it off my fingers and threw it in the woods and kept going. But the bite itself, it turned red. Didn't get the classic bullseye rash, which is another misconception. You are not always going to get any kind of rash, let alone the bullseye rash. The bullseye rash is common, but not nearly as common as what people think it is, if that makes any kind of sense.
Yeah. I quickly looked it up to see if there was a better preservation method. I didn't find anything on the bullseye, but yeah, no, I've heard a lot of people don't get that. And alcohol was mentioned. The other thing is just a moist towel in a Ziploc bag, or throw it in with a leaf for whatever reason.
Yep.
Because it may help keep it alive, where the alcohol will kill it, and you can send it in, and they can test it while it's still alive potentially. So there's a few options.
So another big myth, which we already covered, but just to bring it out there, is ticks don't jump. Ticks are basically not even an ambush predator. They are literally like a dangling predator. They climb up on longer grasses, shorter shrubs, and they just wait with their legs kind of flapping in the breeze for the first thing that they can hook into and carry them off. Now, if it's a inhospitable host, they may later fall off in a new location, which is how you can get ticks traveling, or they'll attach themselves. And once again, you'll never know it was there. Gratification, nonetheless. So, and this is the other thing. A lot of people just throw them on the ground and they smash them into bits, or they burn them, or whatever else, because, you know, it's, you little bugger. But you should try to refrain from that, especially if it was embedded, and try to preserve it for at least around 30 days is what I like to recommend. And we're already getting ticks here in Nova Scotia. Steve, who's still in the comments here with us, he just pulled one off his dog 5 minutes before the show started. He's already had 2 on him this year, I think. Or at least 2 on his cat, maybe 1 on him. I know that he's had 5 already. I've pulled 2 off my dog. Lily, who was literally just in my side lawn, wasn't even around any kind of tall grass. She had 1 on her stomach already this year. I've had 2 on me, but I mean, I'm tromping through the woods, so I kind of expect to get them on me. Like, they are out. And I had them as early as the start of April, I think. There was still snow on the ground when I got my first one. Because we had a thaw, and they got active, and then we had some snow. But anyway, I had 1 on me. Last year, I think I had around 15, 20 on me for the course of the year.
Big thing with search and rescue is we stopped calling it a seasonal thing. We now openly admit it and openly portray that do know that it is a year-round phenomenon right now.
And it is, and this is much like we talked about with the things getting warmer. You know, the seasons are warmer, our winters are warmer. To kill ticks, you kind of need a very long spell of cold. Ticks lay their eggs, and it takes a lot to kill them. They're a hardy insect. And we don't have those long periods of cold to knock off some of those eggs. So these insects are booming because they can feed on pretty much any kind of creature that has blood in it. You know what I mean? That's all they need. They want blood, they take the protein, and it's only the females that really drink blood, eh? But they also drink them as nymphs. And this is leading into my next myth. It's only the adult ticks that can get you sick. You can get nymphs, or, you know, it's not the larval stage and it's not the adult stage. It's kind of in between that. It's called the nymph stage. They can bite you, they still drain blood, and they can still potentially infect you with other diseases. And they're really small.
So, a new fear activated. Thank you.
No worries. I mean, it's once again, it's a little more unlikely because the diseases tend to take time to cultivate in these creatures themselves. but it's still a possibility. This is why anytime you've been out in the woods and you come home, it's good to take all your clothes, put them directly in the washer. Don't throw them on the floor in a pile, which we're all guilty of course. I've done it myself, landed in from a long outing. Basically, it's just stripped down out of my old clothes and laid down on the couch to try and take a nap because I had been like 6 days in the woods and I'm basically just bamboozled. You know what I mean? But that's not the best thing to do. One, you're not checking yourself for ticks. Two, if there was a tick that wasn't embedded on you, it potentially crawl off you and now it's in your house just flaying around your furniture and stuff, much like your clothes. If one had been on your clothes, now it got to your body, you throw them on the floor, now it can crawl around, it might pick up on one of your animals. It is best to come home, strip, straight into the washer. If you are able to, wash those clothes and any clothes you had out in the woods in hot water and then dry them on a hot setting. Because I have seen ticks survive washing and I have seen ticks survive drying. But generally, if you can get them both with hot water and a longer cycle, it'll do them in. But I mean, it's still good to check and give a look over things. And then, of course, once that's all said and done, tick check. There's nothing that beats a good old-fashioned tick check.
Yeah, for sure. Any other myths that you can think of?
There's a lot, but those are the big ones. Now, tick removal. There's a couple myths behind that I kind of wanted to bring up, and I'm sure you're going to recognize some of these, because I know you're going to smirk when you hear this one. The old put butter over it, or put saran wrap over it, or put something over it. It's going to block off its air, and it's going to back out. Not a good way to remove ticks.
No, and here is the one, like take a bit of alcohol and put on a swab and rotate it around it, and it'll back out. Still not really the recommended means. Some people say you twirl around them clockwise or counterclockwise, they get dizzy and they'll back out. I've never seen that successful.
I have seen the cotton ball thing swabbed around and a couple of them come out, but honestly I think it was more because it wasn't really fully embedded. And I just kind of wanted to get away from being picked at because I wanted to move to a location where it's not going to get knocked off as easy. Just twirling a cotton ball around is you're just simulating going through the brush, and it thinks it's just getting slapped around, you know what I mean? And all it thinks is, oh, this is a crap spot to try and have a meal. I'm going to move somewhere else. And this is kind of where the problem becomes. If it was feeding to any amount, for them to back out, they have to regurgitate a little of that fluid back out so they can lubricate their mouth parts and stuff and try and pull it out of your body. And we've already covered at the start of the show that once they start regurgitating, that is where, you know, the chance of getting something bad just skyrockets.
Yeah. So the best method, the tick tool, which is like a little fork, get as close to the skin, hook it under the head, and in a twisting and pulling motion, just pull them straight off. And the nice thing with those is the fork is usually designed so that the handle is directly above. So when you spin, you're spinning it without like causing a great twist off center and sort of rip it apart more than pull it off. Or just a good old-fashioned pair of tweezers, grab it as close to the head as you can and pull. I find personally a nice slow pull is more likely to work than a quick jab, because what you're going to do is rip it a half, right?
And if you are going to use tweezers, the preferred tweezers are needle point tweezers, so they don't have the classic like two flat sides for pulling splinters out. They're literally like a needle point. And I thought I had a pair here for reference, but I don't. But just look up needle point tweezers. As Ben said, get nice and close to the head, pull up with firm but even pressure. And then afterwards, of course, scrub it with soap and water, give it a good look, make sure none of the mouth parts came off in there, because even if it didn't regurgitate and you're not getting any kind of bacterial infection from that, if you have foreign bodies embedded into your skin, that can lead to skin infections and other problems there. And like Scott said, sometimes localized swelling and redness can be mistaken for a bullseye rash, and if you have some of the mouth parts left in there, it's real easy to get that localized swelling and redness. Another one that I've heard, and I've seen it used a lot, heat up a needle and poke it.
That's crazy.
My father used to do that faithfully for taking ticks out. You heat up a needle and then you just give it a quick poke and it pops and then you pull it out and everything is great. Once again,
Yeah,
when you startle these suckers, they're gonna regurgitate.
yeah. I think the match head was another one. Light a match, blow it out, put the hot head onto it.
Yep, same as leeches. These are not good ways to remove leeches either, because now they're throwing that blood up back potentially into your bloodstream. So that's not good. I've heard about putting butter on them, the cotton balls, burning them off, just pulling them off your fingers. You just pinch and pull. Oh, it gets everything. No, there's a real good chance that it's not going to. Honestly, the best method is a proper tick removal tool, like Ben said, or some needle nose tweezers. And I mean, for me, those are the big myths I wanted to dispel. Simply because of the misinformation that's floating around out there. And honestly, some of the information that you find from credible sites and other resources can sometimes conflict with each other. So this is what I have found to be true for my area and my understanding. And I always err on the side of caution. That's why I always say if a tick is embedded, there's always a risk. Keep that tick. And if you start getting sick, you at least have it with you.
And I can't emphasize enough, after you've removed the tick, make sure you sterilize that area as best you can. Because if it didn't fully infect you, if there's a chance to stop it at that point, however small, it's, a bit of polysporin or a bit of alcohol is not going to hurt and may help. So no harm in trying that for sure.
So now that we've had all these, bad things to say about ticks, here's some of the reality for ticks. You're not going to escape them if you go out in the woods. I mean, you kind of got to come to a certain amount of peace with that. If you like to go hiking, you like to go diving into the woods and things like that, you kind of got to make peace with you are potentially going to have a tick on you. Myself, last year, like I said, I probably had 20 ticks embedded on me. I frequent the woods a lot. I frequent fields a lot because I hunt. And that's the other thing. Anywhere where there's going to be high deer populations, generally you are going to get higher tick populations, especially from my area. Ticks travel a lot on deer. The deer I harvested last year, I think we counted 15 or 16 ticks on it, which is once again why if you are a hunter and you're harvesting venison, make sure all your meat is cooked thoroughly. There's other things like trichinosis and things like that you're killing as well as you're cooking this stuff. But you're also going to kill a lot of the bacteria and things in there as well. I guess, real quick story, just because it's my tick story and everybody hates this. Do you know the Lake Agmont area? Because it wasn't too far from where you used to live.
Yep.
So Lake Agmont, if anybody is familiar with Nova Scotia, Lake Agmont and the surrounding areas was the initial hotspot for the province for ticks. Now the entire province is basically a hotspot for Lyme and ticks like that. But Lake Agmont was bad. It was a area that was full of deer population because there wasn't a lot of hunting there for a long time. It's full of farming fields and stuff like that. It was just basically the ideal breeding ground for ticks. When I worked for Natural Resources, we got a call that there was an eagle with a broken wing that was in the woods. So one of my fire crew and I, Matt, we rolled up and we put on, the lights and stuff, and we stop and we look, and sure enough, you can see this eagle. It is literally less than 50 feet off the road. You know what I mean? You got to go down a ditch, up a small incline, and into the woods, and here's this eagle. So I walk in, I take the cage, I try to get this eagle, I finally get it into the cage, and I come back out. 15, 20 minutes, tops, you know what I mean? We're, once again, only talking 50 feet into the woods. I come back out, and we start pulling ticks off me, and we start counting. For a 20-minute adventure, 50 feet into the woods, we lost count around 80. Not embedded, don't get me wrong, I didn't have all these embedded on me. And of course, as soon as I knew I was going to Lake Agmont, the old socks came up over the pant legs, the shirt got tucked in, I put my coveralls on, the whole 9 yards. But yeah, literally around 80, we started losing track of them, and we were just like, holy crap, this is a lot. We found them in the truck for 2 or 3 days afterwards. You'd just be like driving along and you'd see a tick crawl across the seat. And Matt actually, who had not even gone into the area because we knew it was a tick hotspot, neither of us liked ticks, but I said, Matt, you stay here. I'll go in. I'll take a bullet on this one. You get the next one. Matt, who had not been in the area, ended up finding one embedded in his belly button the next day.
See, and I'm going to say this, at that point, that you should have stripped off to your underwear and just burned your clothes.
Well, I took
Right
the
there,
coveralls off and gave them a flick, trust me. And then I took all those clothes home, and I think I ran them through the washer 3 or 4 times. And I believe I ended up, we all kept spare clothes at Natural Resources. I think once I got back to the office, I did grab a shower, give myself a quick tick check, and change. And to my credit, I never had a tick embedded into me from that whole experience.
Good.
Now, kind of a life hack, for lack of a better explanation on this. You know those lint rollers you can get from the dollar store, the ones that are sticky and you just peel sheets off them? Those things are great from going over the outside of your clothes to pull ticks off you. If you are by yourself, you're hiking around a lot, throw one of those into your bag. When you get to an area where you're going to stop and rest, just go over your body. You will be surprised at the amount of bugs that you didn't know was on you that one of those suckers will pick up.
Good idea.
Oh, it's amazing. And then the tick is stuck to it, too, and you can actually study it a little bit. When we did our tick studies, you want to know our advanced method for capturing ticks?
Duct tape.
A white sheet and 2 people walking along grass. You literally just take a white sheet, find an area where you know they're prominent, and you just drag it along. Once again, ticks are opportunists. They just latch onto things, so they feel the sheet, brush over them, the little tentacles on their legs will hook into it, and bam, you got them. It's kind of, like I said, they're fascinating if they weren't so blood-sucking parasite-ish. So, I know Scott's still in the comments here. Was there anything you wanted to add to this conversation, Scott? Because we are kind of coming to the end of where we are. And same thing for you, Ben. Is there anything you wanted to add to the tail end of this conversation? Anything you think people should know about ticks?
No, it's a simple thing, but, it is important. It is your health and safety, so I just can't, stress enough to take it seriously, but don't think it's something that should prevent you from going into the woods. Just take those precautions. Use the chemical methods. Pull your socks over your pants. Wear the gaiters. Do the checks. Use your lint roller trick if you want. Like you said, get your clothes into the washer. At least just even run them through a hot, quick dryers cycle just to kill any off if you have to, when you can. And while you're in the woods, be vigilant and don't be afraid, to do those checks, and be careful. But yeah, it's an important thing, but it should not be something that's going to stop you from getting out into the woods. And if you see any symptoms, the earlier you get to the doctor, the better it is.
Early diagnosis and treatment is key for having very quick recoveries. The longer you wait and shrug it off, the more chance you have of having serious complications. Scott here can tell you, it sounds like it's starting to hit some of his organs and stuff, and his was relatively quick treatment. You know what I mean? So imagine that going longer and the difficulties building, how hard it's going to be to recover from that.
Like you said, you'd rather have COVID any day than go through this again. So, an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of pain. Take care of yourself. Yeah, that's about it, though, for me. I mean, if you have something else you want to add, for sure.
No, the only thing I was going to add was just kind of to reiterate what you said. Make sure you do your tick checks. Tick check for anybody that's out in the woods should be a household term. Even if there's a giggle about it, if you have a significant other, it's even better. You can get really thoroughly checked. And if you're just in the woods for extended periods of time, it's worth just doing a tick check on yourself in the woods. And it doesn't have to be too extensive. I mean, it's just a quick look at your clothes. Take your hand and just rub over any bare skin. Hands through the hair, just like you're washing your hair, kind of back and forth. Feel if there's anything that shouldn't be there. In behind your ears, earlobes, literally just kind of rub over your entire body, and it'll feel like a pine needle or a flake of dirt or something that just shouldn't be there. And if you find it, don't just immediately try to, rip it out of your skin, because that's the other thing when people are doing tick checks, they tend to drag their nails and pull stuff out. Once again, we're back to this improper way of removing ticks. If you know it's there, acknowledge it, and then try to get eyes on it before you handle it. That way you know if it is embedded, if it's not embedded, if it is a tick, if it isn't a tick. It could be something else too, you know what I mean? And Yeah, that's pretty much it for me. Is just be vigilant and don't take it too lightly. Don't take it too seriously either. Don't not go out and have fun. We just got to learn to live with this, and just be vigilant to keep yourself safe.
I don't know if you mentioned it, but I did read it. If you have no other means, just stick it inside of a piece of tape.
Yeah,
And then we send it to the hospital or the testing facility, and they will open the tape up and get what they need to test. And clear tape, the beauty is like a good expert can still look at it and get enough information to identify the species if they're worried of specific things, right?
and not that I was involved in this part of it, but I believe all they need to do is stick a small needle into basically where the stomach area would be and remove a tiny, tiny sample of that to start doing their tests. Let's see. I've read some state parks here are doing RX fire for ticks. Prescription burning, you mean? I guess that's a point to bring up as well. I wasn't going to touch on it, but seeing you're talking about it there, Scott. I don't know about the rest of the world, but here in Nova Scotia and most of Canada, in the spring, it is very common to burn your grass. Now, the reason people burn the grass, it's kind of misleading, misjudged. A lot of people burn it because they think it makes the grass grow back greener. The reality is it does not. It actually stunts the grass growth, but now you have something that's greener against a black background. It looks greener than it would otherwise. You end up nitrogen shocking it, plus you get all that heat. You end up scorching the roots and blah, 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 blah. You actually do more harm than good. But the good thing that comes from this is you do tend to burn off tick eggs.
Thing is, you can't burn enough to get rid of them all, and they'll just spread again quickly.
Yeah, they breed and spread incredibly fast.
All it does is a temporary fix, and they'll still come back, and potentially with a vengeance, because there's an ish left in the environment that they're trying to fill. But yeah, temporary, short-term effect. And obviously, always be careful if you're ever starting a fire in the woods that you can actually control it, because it only takes a second for it to get out of control. And every year in my area of Nova Scotia when I was there, and I know your area also, they have numerous ones that get out of control, and the fire department has to come put them out. And there are fines if you're not doing it with the right permits and protections.
So Scott's closing remarks are do your checks and get doxy if you get bit. And by doxy means doxycycline there, which is an antibiotic. And that's just it. Do your checks. If you find one, get to your doctor. And that's the thing here in Nova Scotia, I guess, is if it's suspected that you have been bitten by a black-legged tick, 9 times out of 10, they're just going to give you a shot for it. And it's a high dose of antibiotics. And it's just kind of like that blanket cover. Like, this will do something to slow it down, and we will monitor for symptoms afterwards. And I don't know what it's like anywhere else, but I know that's very common practice here. If you're like, yeah, I was bit by a tick, they think it was a black-legged tick, I'm not showing symptoms, they'll be like, yeah, well, give you the old jab, and off you go.
Yeah, for sure.
46-2 has joined us there, and yes, ticks are SOBs. Like I said, they're very interesting creatures if they weren't blood-sucking parasites.
Yeah.
But
very good. I think you had a lot to do tonight, and so do I. So
yes, sir. I think that's as good a place as any to end it. Yeah. So lead us out, Ben.
Yeah. Thanks for joining us. Like we always say, get out there and have some fun. Be safe and test any equipment before you leave. And we look forward to seeing you next week.
Night, everybody. Have a good night.